Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called So That Happened, 8 Incredibly Weird UFO Encounters. There are no humanoids in this episode. These are all close encounters of the second kind, and by that I mean cases in which UFOs affected the physical environment in some way. So yeah, no humanoids, but I guarantee it, you will find these cases very interesting. They're incredibly strange. I've got cases from a wide variety of locations, one from Denmark, two from Poland, and 5 from the United States, including Connecticut, Louisiana, Massachusetts, New York, and West Virginia. These cases reach back to 1966 up to 2013, pretty recent, but most importantly, they contain really compelling evidence, the full range of evidence we see associated with UFO encounters, including radar returns, actual photographs of UFOs, but landing traces, electromagnetic disturbances, physiological effects, animal reactions, the whole deal. And boy oh boy are these cases weird. First case I'd like to talk about today, I call a UFO collides into a house. This is a very strange case. I hadn't heard it before. I was quite stunned to hear about this one, which does involve multiple witnesses, multiple events, actually has radiation readings along with it. It's a very compelling case. It occurred on April 23rd, 1966 in Dorchester, Massachusetts. I think you're going to find this one really amazing. It was about 10:45 p.m. on April 23rd, 1966, when Jeanne Kalnicki was in her apartment home located at 1284 Dorchester Avenue. This is in Dorchester, which is a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. And she was listening to a WMEX radio talk show moderated by Steve Fredericks. And this is when he took a phone call from a woman in the area who said she had just seen a UFO moving over Dorchester Avenue, which is Jeanne Kalnicki's street. She was shocked, so she quickly grabbed 2 of her 6 children, Judy, age 11, Robin, age 9, and ran with both of them to the front bedroom of their 3rd floor apartment, which overlooked Dorchester Avenue. And looking out the window, they were shocked to see a UFO floating just a few feet away outside of her apartment windows, floating right across Dorchester Avenue, right above Ernie's Auto Repair Shop. Now this craft had a typical saucer shape, had one large yellow light and circular red blinking lights around the circumference with a transparent bubble on top. These lights were all flashing on and off, and the craft itself was bobbing up and down as it moved to the south direction. But then it stopped, hovered over a sign on top of the Osterbilt Company building. And as it started to move out of view, the 3 witnesses as a group ran back to the living room to look out the other window, and they watched as it crossed the street and now came straight towards them, exactly at eye level. In fact, it approached so close that they feared a collision and stepped back from their window. At this point, they could hear it making a low humming sound as it passed right between their apartment building and the one next door. It then moved almost to the end of the alleyway between the buildings, then stopped and hovered for several minutes. And as this yellow light on top blinked off and on, they could see that this transparent dome on top was glowing from within. Then the object moved erratically off to the east and was gone. But the encounter wasn't over yet. Jean, Judy, and Robin returned to the front bedroom and excitedly discussed their sighting. At this point, Jean's 17-year-old son David walked in after walking the dog outside, and hearing his family, he called the newspaper and learned that numerous people in the area had called in to report seeing a UFO, presumably the same one. It turned out that there was in fact an advertising plane flying that night in the area with a big sign behind it, and this was being used to explain the sighting, but further research by Raymond Fowler showed that this plane had actually landed at 10:30, which absolutely ruled out the Kalnicki family's sighting. So they were so excited by their encounter that most of them were unable to sleep that night. And hours later at 5 a.m., 11-year-old Judy was lying awake in bed thinking about the encounter. Her 9-year-old sister, Robin, was asleep in the bed by the window. So Judy's still thinking about this strange craft when there's suddenly a brilliant flash of light, which lights up the window right through the Venetian blinds and illuminates her bed. Now this filled her with fear, but she was too afraid to call attention to herself, so she called out softly to her mother. Now when her mom didn't hear, Judy leapt out of bed and walked up to the window. Looking out, she saw this same object again, only this time it was close enough that had the window been open, she said, she could have actually reached out and probably touched it. She said it was about the size of a car, disc-shaped, with, again, red lights around the edge, a dome on top with a bright yellow blinking light. And as she saw it, this object began to bob up and down in front of the window. So Judy at this point is rooted to the spot with fear. She screams in terror, and as if in response, the object begins to bob up and down even more quickly. And then suddenly there was a heavy, dull thud as this object apparently struck the side of the house. In fact, all of the windows in the house rattled. Judy's bed rocked back and forth, and all the lights in the house immediately went out. And as Judy herself says, it was so close I could almost touch it. It had a bubble on top that seemed to be round with red lights around the edge. It seemed to be made partly of silvery gray metal with no doors. It banged against the house as we watched it. I was sitting in my bed and it rocked the bed back and forth. Then the lights in the house went out. So still screaming, Judy ran from her room. At that same moment, their German Shepherd dog whined and scratched at the back porch door. Jeanne, her son David, and two friends, Mary Burdick and Helen Litchfield, all together ran out onto the back porch and saw this same object again. Only by this point it had moved off a mile or two away. They watched it for about 12 minutes, at which point the house lights came back on. So they returned inside, and David called the Dorchester police. They immediately tried to explain the sighting away as a nightmare or lightning, but there was a Boston Globe photographer at the police station when the Kalnickis called. So he went directly to their house along with Roland Oxlin, another newspaper photographer. And per Roland, the kids were, quote, still hysterical and crying. Now, UFO researcher Walter Webb heard about this sighting and did some investigations, and he learned that there was in fact a power failure affecting 2,500 homes, and it was at the exact same time of the Kalnicki's sighting. So that tracked perfectly. And in fact, tracing this power failure, they found two faulty cables on pole number 2 on East Street, which was located only 1 block northwest of the Kalnicki's residence. Now, NICAP researcher Ernest Reed went to the house and tested the windowsill in Judy's room with a Geiger counter, and he did find evidence of radiation that was beyond normal levels. And Walter Webb, after speaking to all the witnesses and Judy, he was convinced that Judy, who was in fact an honor student, was telling the truth. As he says, if it were a hoax, she was a very good actress to cry as convincingly as she did. Police officers and news photographers found the whole family upset. I questioned Judy very closely. I don't think someone perpetrating a hoax could make a child stick to such a detailed story under repeated interrogations over such a long period. Her account impressed me, to say the least. And as Judy says, I always used to say that there was no such thing as a flying saucer. I thought those people who said they saw them were making it up. Now that I saw one myself, I never want to see one again. Now, in further support of the Kalnicki's case, only 1 day earlier, and a mere 32 miles to the north on the evening of April 22nd, 1966, at around 9 p.m., Nancy Modugno, age 11, looked out her bedroom window in Beverly, Massachusetts, and saw an incredibly strange-looking object flying just above Sohere Road. This is only 40 feet from her window. And as she says, the object had 4 lights, red, blue, green, and a lamp color. It looked like a football, but was the size of a car. On top it had no windows. The front was pointed. I was terrified. I had no idea what it was. It would be like if a car was in the air right outside your window. That's how I remember it being. I think it was metallic, and I remember the flashing lights. I knew instantly that it was nothing I'd ever seen before. She rushed down, told her parents. They didn't believe her at first, but finally she persuaded them to go outside, and they all, a whole group of adults, saw this object hovering over nearby Beverly High School. And in fact, it came so low overhead, dropping out of the sky, that one of the witnesses was so frightened she actually urinated herself. I did cover this case in more detail in my episode on schoolyard encounters, if you'd like to hear more about this. But it's amazing confirmation of a case that occurred the day later. And one final, probably related case occurred on April 12, 1966. This is again in Dorchester. It was around 7:45 p.m. when witnesses saw a low-flying, oval-shaped object with a dome and colored lights. It exhibited the same behavior as seen over Beverly. It circled over a schoolhouse, bobbing up and down, and at the time there was an unexplained power failure in the neighboring town of Roxbury. Then, 5 days later on April 17, 1966, a UFO was seen hovering over a school in Peabody, Massachusetts. Again, it was oval with a dome on top and had red, green, blue, and white lights. And after hovering, the object moved rapidly away with an oscillating motion. How weird is that? There are not a lot of cases like that. In fact, I think that one is probably unique in the UFO literature. There might be some out there that just haven't been reported. But like many cases, this one involves a series of events. Rarely is a UFO encounter a one-off and isolated event. Usually there are a lot of people experiencing activity in a location at one time. But again, most people don't report it. And would you if something like that happened? All right, let's move on to the next case, which is also incredibly weird. I mean, just beyond bizarre. I call this one a UFO with a message. This occurred on December 12, 1967 in Ithaca, New York. And this was during a very intense wave of UFO sightings, the full range of encounters. But this one involved a lady who received a very personal message. ETs do provide messages to people. This kind of message is incredibly profound, very personal, really poignant, and I think you'll find this case really compelling. This exceptionally unusual case was investigated by William D. Donovan. And again, it took place during a huge wave of activity in Ithaca, New York. And in fact, it involved about 1,000 sightings over a very short period of time. But the primary witness in this case is Rita Malley, age 24. She's a part-time beautician and mother of 2. Her daughter Renee was 6 months old at the time, and her son Dana was in kindergarten. Now on the night in question, December 12, 1967, she was driving home from North Lansing, where she had visited a friend, to her home in South Lansing, New York. Her son Dana was in the back seat. They were on Route 34 between Auburn and Ithaca, and her son was jibber-jabbering like crazy, just talking like a little kid does. Rita was paying very close attention to driving as the wind was blowing quite strong and there were occasional snow flurries. It's about 7 p.m. and coming around a corner, Rita noticed something very strange. As she says in her own words, "I noticed this brilliant red glow, like on the inside of my car. I thought, it's a police car. I've been speeding. I looked in the rear view mirror and saw nothing. There was nothing but this red light covering everything. And I thought, what is it? And I could just figure it out. And I was shaken like a leaf trying to figure a way out of this. So she thought it was the police, but she didn't see any police car, nor did she hear any sirens, so she just kept driving. And that's when the UFO appeared. And as Rita says, I was suddenly panicked. This object, whatever it was, suddenly appeared on my left. It came into sight over a telephone pole. I glanced out and I saw brilliant red and green lights underneath an object that was airborne. It must have been 55 to 60 feet in diameter. It was round and had a little dome-like thing on the top, and it tilted once. You couldn't look right out and stare at it for long because the lights were so bright from it. So at this point, Rita realized that her son Dana was unnaturally quiet, and she looked back at him and saw that his eyes were bugging out of his head, is how she put it. So she screamed at him, "Are you all right?" And weirdly, he didn't respond in any way. He just sat there staring straight ahead as if in a complete trance. So she looked back at the object. She could see it was about 120 feet high, 180 feet away. And the next thing she knew, this object sent down a beam of light which struck her car. As she says, it extended a white beam of light from underneath, and it just completely took right over the controls of my car. My car stopped moving when it stopped. My first thought was to grab Dana and get out of the car and run. Then I thought, what good is it to run? This object, this thing, has got complete control of me. I was shaking. I just didn't know what to do, what was happening. I became hysterical. I couldn't scream. My throat felt tight. It was dry. The situation was weird. This was the first time I had ever been really scared. My eyes started hurting, started burning, and I couldn't swallow. So there were no other cars on the road. Her headlights had gone out. She did see the lights of a house, but they were about a mile away. She tried stamping on the accelerator, but nothing happened. Then the colored lights on this object started flashing, and she realized that her car was now moving. As she says, this thing was taking me off the road. I twisted and turned the steering wheel in the opposite direction, but no matter what I did, I even tried using the brakes to stop, my car gradually moved sideways and took me under the shoulder of the road. So this object pulled her car about 10 feet off the shoulder. Rita could now actually hear the object, which was making a humming sound, which she said was very much like a swarm of bees, or maybe a TV antenna blowing in the wind. Then the humming sound stopped, and this is when she heard voices talking to her. And again, I'll just let Rita describe this. As she says, these voices came out of the thing, this hovering object. I want to explain. My windows were rolled up tight, and as I said, the wind was blowing. The voices sounded like a group of people, a chorus of voices. They were all talking at the same time, saying the same thing, only they spoke as if what they were saying was being translated into English, because the words were broken. These were not impressions in my mind. They were external, coming from that hovering thing. They sounded like maybe they were talking through a loudspeaker, but not quite. I couldn't tell whether they were male or female. There were so many of them all at once. They gave me a dreadful message. So speaking in chorus, the voices from this UFO said, and I quote, Paul Donalds, Moravia, killed in Messina in a tractor trailer owned by Joe Ettinger, Moravia. So Rita recognized this man's name. In fact, Paul Donalds was the sister of her friend Marion Donalds. The voices continued and said, Your son will not remember the time stop from the car from the time you left the highway. So that was the message. At this point, the UFO moved her car back onto the road, she said. Her car lights came back on, and the car, still apparently under control of the UFO, moved on down the highway. The object was to her left at this point and coming around a straightaway, The object slowly moved off, and Rita was able to regain control of her car. Now, it took a little bit longer for her to regain her composure, and finally she thought of her son and asked him if he saw anything. She said, "Did you see what Mama saw?" And he replied, "No." So she drove home to find her husband John concerned about why she was so late. She didn't want to tell him. He became increasingly concerned by her silence, and she was clearly upset. So he asked her repeatedly what had happened, and finally she just broke down in tears and told him everything. She said physically she had a headache, some eye pain and neck pain, and her husband was absolutely shocked by this story. He just wanted to forget the whole thing, as frankly Rita did herself. But that evening she did have a nightmare about the incident, and the next afternoon she got a shocking phone call from her sister who said, "What do you think of Paul Donald getting killed in Messina?" Rita was of course shocked, asked her sister what happened, and it was just as these voices from the UFO had said. He had been killed in a tractor trailer owned by Joel Ettinger. The accident happened around 4 p.m. on December 12, which was about 3 hours before Rita's sighting and about 75 miles away. Paul Donald was only 29 years old. So Rita's case generated huge interest when it was published in Popular Science magazine and Fate magazine, and reportedly other experiences followed, but she became so tired of all the publicity and attention she was getting, she refused to discuss her experiences any further with any researchers. How weird is that? I mean, there are a lot of cases where people do receive messages, but having a UFO come down and warn you that someone you know has passed on, wow, very strange. And in support of Rita's testimony are the many, many cases that were occurring in that area at that time. Really incredible. Now let's move to another case, which is very well verified. This one has photographs, it has radar returns, it's got a great witness, a police officer. It's an incredibly well investigated case as well, probably one of Denmark's most famous UFO encounters. I call this one a very hot UFO. This occurred on August 30, 1970 in Haderslev, Jutland, Denmark. And I'm actually going to include two cases in this segment because there's one that occurred after it that's remarkably similar and equally strange and compelling. So as I said, this case is Denmark's perhaps most famous and best verified UFO encounters, certainly among them, and it garnered national headlines and was covered in numerous UFO publications across the world. The witness is Danish police officer Evald Hansen Marup. He was 38 years old at the time of his encounter, and it was on August 30, 1970, around 10:50 p.m. He was driving alone in his patrol car. This was an almost brand new 6-cylinder Ford Zodiac. He was on an isolated road about 8 to 10 kilometers north of Haderslev, Denmark. And this is when his life changed forever. He was near the T-junction of the Haderslev Veltrup Highway, crossing the road to Kabdrup, and as Evald says in his own words, suddenly the car was surrounded by a bright bluish-white light, and at the same time the engine stopped. The lights of the car also disappeared, even the light of the ignition. I drove aside the road and stopped. The bright neon light outside was so dazzling that I could see nothing. With my arm hiding my eyes to protect them against the light, I succeeded in groping my way to the radio. When I got to the microphone and tried to call this station, it appeared that the radio was just as dead as any of the electric installations in the car. So now, with his car dead and the dazzling lights blinding him, Evald had no choice but to sit in his car and wait to see what would happen next. And soon events escalated to a very concerning level, because as Evald says, the temperature inside the car was increasing, and it became pleasantly hot. It could be compared to the heat you feel when you drive against the sun on a summer day. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to the light over his patrol vehicle, and at the same time the beam of light began to slowly retract, allowing him to see the object, which he estimates was about 20 meters or 60 feet away. And as Ewald says in his own words, after a while the light was rising. It was a conical light with a diameter of 4 to 5 meters. When I was bending forwards and looking up, I could see that the light cone ended at the bottom of a big gray thing. If I should describe the thing, I can only say that it was circular and about 10 meters in diameter seen from my position obliquely from below. The object had two extensions or domes at the underside. They were about 1 and 1.5 meters in diameter. Not a sound was heard from this thing. After a few seconds, the light was drawn into the thing. It is difficult to explain how. The light was not extinguished, but the bottom of the light was rising so that it became dark under the cone. It took about 5 minutes for the light to be drawn up. I stepped out of the car and saw how the last remnant of the light cone disappeared into the bottom of the thing in a hole with a diameter of not quite a meter. So, when Ewald stepped out from his car, he touched the hood and almost burned himself on the hood of the car. It was so hot. And as the cone of light retracted back into the object, it started moving away, slowly at first. Ewald thought quickly and managed to snap a series of 6 photographs of this object with the police car's camera as it moved off. 3 of them did not come out, but 3 of them clearly show this object. In a matter of a few seconds, it vanished vertically into the air, still totally silent. It was around this time that another car did pass him on the highway, and Ewald thought about flagging this driver down to ask if they had seen anything, but the object was gone, so he just let the car drive by. He did check his own cruiser and the surrounding area, but noticed nothing unusual. He got back into his car. He estimates the entire encounter lasted just a couple of minutes. And as Ewald says, when the object moved away, all lights in the electric system of the car returned. I tried to start it, and it started quite normally, just as I again was able to get in touch with the station. I reported to the station what I had experienced. So this is when he found out that another motorist had also called the station and reported that his car was stopped in roughly the same area on the same night. So returning home that evening, Ewald's wife immediately noticed that he was pale and frightened. He told her about what happened. He also called the nearest Danish Air Force base, who was very interested in what happened and actually took his film for analysis. He also shared his encounter with his fellow police officers. Most believed him, though there was one who expressed some concern about Ewald's mental health. Now, it wasn't long before reporters heard about his encounter, and Ewald granted a few interviews, but when his experience was published in newspapers, he began to receive constant phone calls and interview requests, which became so numerous that he came to regret going public with his encounters. Now, it turned out that several people in the area did say that they had also seen UFOs on that same night. After 3 months of investigation, the Danish Air Force closed their investigation of the case, saying that they didn't think Ewald had a UFO encounter, and that perhaps he had seen the landing lights of a passing jet aircraft, while at the same time there was a meteor in the sky, and at the same time his car, which by the way again was almost new, coincidentally malfunctioned. So a pretty obviously debunking explanation. Few people agreed with this, and in fact Ewald himself did recall seeing Air Force jets about 10 minutes after his encounter, and they looked quite different. Now, many years later, he found out that a radar operative for the Air Force, his name is Nis Krag, said that he had also seen a UFO on his radar scope on the very same night of Ewald's encounter, and in the same area. And the story doesn't end here, because by incredible coincidence, exactly 3 years and 1 day later, on August 14, at 10:50 p.m., pretty much the same exact time, Ewald was on the same road, this time near Skoballing, about 2 kilometers south of his original encounter, when he saw a bright light shining over a field coming from a saucer-type UFO. And in this field, he could see several horses and cattle panicking and running around inside this cone of light. And in an incredible replay of his previous encounter, this UFO moved towards him, came right overhead, shone down a cone of light directly onto his patrol car, once again stopping the car's engine and electrical system. This time the object was tilted at a 45-degree angle, projecting the beam of light right at him and allowing him to get a good view of the underside of this saucer-shaped craft, which he said had 3 half-circular bumps, very similar to the object he had seen earlier. This time he did hear a soft whooshing noise coming from the object. He tried to take photos, but they did not come out. Then, 3 years later in 1976, Ewald was driving with another officer along the A10 highway. This was between Kolding and Haderslev, not far away, when they both saw another UFO, a glowing, dome-shaped object floating just above the trees. They drove towards it to get a better look, and the object began to move up and down, then suddenly disappeared. The next day, they did learn from the local newspaper that a woman from a nearby village had seen a UFO on the same evening. Now, perhaps related to Ewald's encounter is another equally, if not more dramatic car stopping case, which also occurred in Jutland, Denmark. This next case occurred on the evening of September 29, 1995, and the witness was 24-year-old Klaus Lundholm, who was heading south between Brand and Velge on his way to visit his parents. He had his pet dog, a black Labrador, in the car, who was laying on the back seat. It was around 9:30 p.m., and he was traveling about 60 kilometers per hour. And suddenly his dog, for no apparent reason, became nervous. Klaus came around a corner in the road and was shocked to see that the instrument dials on his dashboard went completely crazy. His speedometer dial went up to maximum speed, as did the revolutions dial. Now the temperature dial went into the red and the needle started vibrating back and forth. And at the same time, his windshield wipers started going at high speed, and they weren't even turned on. He tried flicking the switch to turn them off, but this had no effect, and his dog at this point became very agitated. And this is when he looked outside his car and saw that his headlights were pulsating in brilliance, becoming dim and then bright. And at the same time his engine began to misfire. Klaus tried pumping the accelerator, but this had no effect. In fact, the engine then went completely dead, as did his headlights and his entire electrical system. The car rolled to a stop in the middle of this dark country road. Now, fearful about what was happening, Klaus tried several times to turn the key and start the car, but nothing happened. He did notice one very weird and curious detail. The clock on the dashboard was faintly lit up, but instead of the normal time, it read the numbers 88, 88, 88. So Klaus at this point felt almost like time had stopped or that he was moving in slow motion. He continued trying to restart the car, and this is when he began to sense an indescribable oppressive presence coming from overhead. He hadn't seen anything at this point, but 20 seconds into all of this, a blindingly brilliant light exploded over his vehicle, coming from above. He said it blinked and pulsated rapidly. His dog began to whine furiously and tried to hide under the back seat. Now, opening the door and kind of leaning halfway out of his car and looking up, Klaus, who was forced to squint against this brilliant light, saw that this light was in fact coming from a huge disc-shaped object right above him. He could see a series of concentric circles of separate lights which were situated on the bottom of the craft, a bunch of them, and they became increasingly brilliant towards the center. The object itself, he estimates, was about 15 meters wide and only 4 meters above the car. So needless to say, this scared him quite badly. He retreated back into his car and shut the door. And looking around him, he could see that the beam of light from this object extended around his car and covered the entire section of the road. He said it was very sharply defined and weirdly did not illuminate the surrounding area. The light, he said, was a very strong blue-white and had a strange quivering quality to it. He was afraid but very curious, so he rolled down his window and stuck his arm and head outside and looked up, and he did notice something else strange. The light seemed to cause a kind of indefinable but powerful sense of peace and tranquility. While he did still have some fear, he says he also felt this incredible, pleasant feeling that he had never experienced before. In fact, he felt like he was about to be taken on board, or that he might see the entities who were piloting this craft. He had a real strong impression that they were recording him or taking his picture in some way. Then, very slowly, the light diminished in intensity, and he saw that the disc-shaped object was now moving forward ahead of him. It moved off towards some nearby trees, so low that it had to tip to avoid hitting them. It then moved out of sight. The entire encounter took place in complete silence. So afterwards, he sat in his car thoroughly shook up, tried to calm his dog down, who appeared to be equally traumatized. The whole encounter lasted, he says, no longer than 1 minute. But after about 3 to 4 minutes of calming down, he tried to start his car. It did start immediately. The electrical system functioned normally, and he drove straight to his parents and told them what happened. Other than sharing the experience with his parents, he told nobody for some time, but after seeing a documentary about UFOs, he decided to contact researchers who began an investigation, and they discovered that the residents of a farmhouse just a few kilometers away said that at 7:20 p.m. on that same evening, they were in their kitchen when an object came over their house and sent down a brilliant beam of light into their yard for a full 5 seconds. Hard to deny cases like that. If there's one thing UFOs are known for, it's coming down over cars driving along at night on a remote highway. There are quite literally hundreds of cases like this. And those two are really compelling cases with quite a bit of evidence, as well as not only the radar and the photographs, but animal reactions, electromagnetic disturbances of a very strange kind. Can you imagine your windshield wipers going off at high speed and everything just going haywire in your car, and then you see this giant craft hovering right overhead? Amazing. Now let's move to another case which is largely unique. I don't know that there are many other cases out there like this. There's a few, but none quite like this. I call this one a silver UFO with prongs. This occurred in October of 1973 in the very tiny town of Wilco, West Virginia. It is a multiple witness case. It doesn't have a whole lot of physical evidence to support it, but with double eyewitness testimony, that certainly adds a level of credibility to it. And this is a case where we see a UFO hovering over high tension wires. Quite a few cases of that as well. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to include this. This very small town of Wilco, West Virginia, had a remarkably unusual encounter witnessed by two people, Mary Rose and her 11-year-old son, Teddy. This case was investigated by David Bodner and Ted Spickler, both MUFON field investigators, and was published in the MUFON UFO Journal. It was just after dark on a Monday evening in October of 1973 as Mary and her son Teddy were walking home after visiting Teddy's grandmother. They were approaching some power lines when suddenly a low-flying, saucer-shaped craft covered with bright lights came swooping overhead from behind them. Teddy wondered for just a second if it might be a helicopter, but the object made only a quiet humming noise, so it clearly wasn't a helicopter. Now at this point, both Rose and Teddy were standing directly under the power lines, and this is when the UFO positioned itself directly above them, and they could see it was a silver-white disc, about 20 feet in diameter, with red, purple, and kind of greenish-blue lights. Rose became filled with fear, when she saw these weird two silver prong-like extrusions coming out from the bottom of this silver disc and lowering down towards them. Now, judging from the advanced look of this object, this craft, she definitely believed it was not ours and was from outer space. And she was terrified it was trying to capture both her and her son. She said she could feel a strange sensation of heat and electricity coming from these lowering prongs. So both Rose and Teddy ran from underneath this object to a nearby tool shed about 60 feet away and hid under the shed. In fact, Rose was so frightened she refused to look at the object and hid her face in her arms. By the time they hid, this object quickly departed, though it took the witnesses a full half hour to compose themselves after this very close and very unusual encounter. A pretty strange case. That barely qualifies as a close encounter of the second kind, but I think it might because the witnesses did feel heat coming from this object. I suspect it was scooping up electricity over the electric lines. We have so many cases of this sort of thing that I think that might be what's going on here. This is, of course, speculation, but turns up a lot. All right, now we move to another case which is so strange, very well investigated by Jeanne Kalnicki himself, and involves multiple witnesses and not some really strange after effects to it, or associated events, I should say. At any rate, I call this one Struck by a Beam of Light from a UFO. This occurred on June 17, 1977 in Cotillet Lake in Louisiana. And what a case this is, because not only is the event itself strange, but what happened afterwards. This next case is a doozy. It was around dusk on June 17, 1977, as five people, Dale Schexnader, he's 26 years old, and his two daughters, Gina, age 14, and Chrissy, age 11, and a couple who were good family friends, were packing up and preparing to go home after a campout at the Cotillet Lake Recreation Area in Louisiana. Dale and his two daughters were walking alone, carrying ice chests, towels, air mattresses, and other camping and fishing and swimming gear. Everyone was just talking, and they had just about reached the road where Dale's pickup was parked, and this is when they all suddenly heard a very strange sound. And I'll just let Dale describe it in his own words. As he says, I became aware of an ultra-low frequency. I heard it and felt it vibrate my sternum simultaneously. I looked up toward the sound, or sensation as it were, and above the tree line was the outline of a huge craft, or UFO. It hovered completely still and had points of lights surrounding its shape. It appeared to have parking lights on. It was huge. I would guess the size to be about 75 feet across, 50 feet high. It was disc-shaped, but plates and sections were clearly visible. At this very instant, the craft floated directly above us, almost. It moved immediately, yet gracefully, almost in a magnetic sense of control. It was much closer now, and less hidden by the trees. The underside was almost horseshoe-shaped and irregular, but anything below these points of light were too shadowed for details. Now, as Chrissy says regarding the sound, it was a sound you could feel more than hear. I was sort of shocked into looking. It didn't remind me of anything. And as Jenny says, I couldn't believe I could be seeing this. I never saw anything like it before. It was awesome in a biblical sort of way. So all of them stopped walking and talking. All of them looked up in absolute open-mouthed astonishment. And then strange went to incredibly weird and bizarre. Because as Dale says, before we could react, the middle of the craft started to glow. But I suspect this was an illusion of a floodlight, for I looked to my side and the children were brightly illuminated, in their shock, mouths still open, holding the swimming gear. Before we could shield our eyes or turn away, there came from the same source several rays or beams of blue light. They were not diffused, but not unlike lasers or laser beams. They appeared to strike us at the solar plexus. It was an intense, silver blue, thin beam, 3 to 5 of them, centered on our bodies. We were immediately affected. I recall hearing crackling sounds in the air right around us, but not loud or threatening. We were trapped in what I guess was a force field, for we couldn't move hardly at all. In a few moments, our entire bodies shone in the eerie blue aura. We slowly forced our head down to see our arms glowing with electric blue light. Movement had become difficult, as in a dream, slow, heavy. So Chrissy remembers this, as she says, "The blue lights were more focused on us. The white lights were broader." And as Gina says, when it shone down on us, like a force field, we just had to stand there and look at it. Dale says, "I had never been subject to such a force field or that type of energy. It kind of fogged my head up. After what seemed to be about 10 seconds, all the lights vanished instantly, along with the force field. The craft began to glide away over the treetops." So at this point, the craft moved off in the direction it had come from, with these weird headlights still on. The loud humming sound faded as this object moved farther away. The children immediately began to frantically jump up and down, shouting, "Did you see that flying saucer? Did you see those lights coming down?" So Dale was absolutely stunned by all of this. He tried to calm them down, find a rational explanation, but there was none, and the children were absolutely convinced that they had seen a flying saucer. And Dale slowly came to the same conclusion, because there was no other explanation. Meanwhile, Gina and Chrissy ran back to the cabin to inform their older sister who was in the cabin, and they shouted out to her, "You'll never believe us, but..." And their sister interrupted and replied, "Oh yes, I will. I heard you outside." So they finished packing up and began the drive home, just the 3 of them, Dale and his 2 daughters. And this is when events became even more strange, because 1 hour later, as they drove home, a man in another car, a drunk driver, ran 2 stop signs and slammed very hard into Dale's pickup truck. And in fact, the truck was pretty much totaled. Dale broke his finger. Gina broke her leg. By coincidence or synchronicity, Chrissy, who normally would sit in the window seat, had been so frightened by the encounter that she insisted sitting in the middle. In the accident, the passenger door was blown open, and everyone thought that had Chrissy been sitting there, she probably would have been ejected from the car and killed. Gina, who was much taller, did have her leg forced under the dashboard, and it was severely mangled. In fact, she was unconscious for 24 hours, spent 2 weeks in the hospital, and wore a cast for the entire summer. So researchers wonder, and I quote, "It is little wonder that they, and especially their parents, believe that the UFO encounter may have prevented the death of at least one of them." So they believe that this was not a coincidence. And of the 2 events, the car accident and the encounter, the UFO encounter was far more shocking. And Dale's not sure if this was coincidence or not, that they were meant to see it, but like his daughters, he believes that he did encounter an extraterrestrial craft. As he says, "I too am convinced, and to this day I cannot recall the memory without heavy moodiness, sometimes getting a little shook up. I am a rational person, but my feet haven't been on the ground since that night. My life has not been the same since that night. I was never frightened until after it was over. Underneath, I was terrified. I thought we were going to die. It was the most frightening and interesting thing I've ever seen. It's an incredible feeling to see something like that. You can sense the intelligence. The culture shock right at first is the most evident thing. Your values changed. You realize that there's someone out there with incredible technology. It's got to change you. It just really changes your outlook. It was the most awesome and unexplainable experience I've ever had. The entire incident was a shock and a bewilderment." So when researchers asked what Jenna would say if someone didn't believe her, she replied, "There's nothing I could say. I know what I saw. I can't make you think I did. You'd have to see it yourself." Now, when Chrissy was asked what the most memorable thing was about the experience, she said, "The blue light. I just remember the light, and that it was real big." So Dale, unable to forget this experience, 2 months later sought help and was put in touch with J. Allen Hynek. In fact, he even considered going under hypnosis to better understand what happened to him and why. As he says, "I know there's something very unfinished about it. I just want to know why." Now, he doesn't think it was a negative experience. In fact, he says he would like to meet extraterrestrials face to face, and all the witnesses want to see the UFO again. As it turns out, this wasn't Dale's first encounter. 7 years earlier, in 1970, he and some high school friends had seen a small craft hovering only 40 feet overhead, sending down a cylindrical shaft of light. They drove near it, at which point it darted away. And in fact, his friends were so frightened, they also fled the scene. How bizarre is that? I do wonder if there's any connection with this auto accident and the sighting itself. The witnesses certainly seem to think so, and they take this as a very benevolent encounter, even though it did affect them profoundly and was quite scary. Such an interesting case. There's always another. Here's one that is probably one of the most bizarre I've ever heard of, and this might only peripherally be involved with UFOs or ETs, but there doesn't seem to be any other explanation. I call this one alien footprints. This occurred on September 4, 1979 in Wrocław, Poland, and it is truly bizarre, as you'll see. I really can't say much more without giving it away. So let's just get to the case. Researcher Piotr Cielabias is the investigator for this incredibly strange case, complete mystery. He wrote about it in his book, UFOs over Poland, and it appears to involve the intrusion of some small humanoid who left footprints inside the witness's house. His name is Jerzy Wasilewski. He had an apartment located at 53-9 Kruszwicka Street in Wrocław, Poland. And in fact, his flat is on the 4th floor of this building, as you can see here. On September 4, 1979, he left his flat, and he had left the kitchen window open. And when he returned, he found that there were 17 strange marks, what looked like footprints, on the blue vinyl floor tiles of his kitchen and hallway. Each mark was about 13 millimeters in diameter, roughly oval in shape, and separated by 40 centimeters. In fact, as Peter writes, it looked as if someone had marched through the kitchen and hall and then returned, leaving in the same direction from which they entered, which presumably was through the open window in the kitchen, where the tracks led. But the thing is, this is the 4th floor, so whoever came in there would have to have either gotten there from street level or floated down into it. Now, the floor was made of polyvinyl chloride tiles, and researcher Piotr had these tiles analyzed at Wrocław University, and the results were nothing less than astonishing. The analysis of these tiles showed that they had not been melted by high heat, as was previously assumed, but instead were affected by some kind of, quote, highly concentrated magnetic field. They did find traces of ozone. The internal structures of the tile were unchanged, meaning there were no crushing marks, no deformations or damage, and there were no traces of burns found either. It was all just this weird magnetic field that had affected them somehow. The, quote, footprints were sort of whitish in color. The area around them was also slightly discolored, but there was no explanation. In other words, it couldn't have been ball lightning. It definitely wasn't any corrosive agent or accelerant. It wasn't a heavy weight. In fact, there was no logical explanation. It appeared exactly as if something had flown in through the open 4th-story window, walked around the kitchen into the hallway, back to the window, and flew off. But with no direct eyewitnesses, the mystery of this remains unsolved. Interestingly, the witness, Jersey, did get a number of offers from, quote, collectors who wanted to buy these weirdly affected floor tiles. So there you go. How weird is that? Looks like some ET walked into this guy's kitchen, floated down from above. He's on the 4th floor, burned his tiles, and went on its merry way. I like this case because these landing traces, if you will, these ET footprints, are almost impossible to fake. So what happened there, nobody knows. But man, oh man, is that bizarre. Now we move to an equally bizarre case, really well verified. I find this one quite interesting because there are some really interesting physical effects and multiple witnesses who are independent of each other. I call this one, I was trying hard to hold on to reality. That is, of course, a direct quote from the witness, who's a highly qualified, very well educated witness. Always adds a level of credibility to a person's account. This one occurred on March 8, 1982 in Bethel, Connecticut. And boy, it's a very strange UFO, very strange effects, as we will see. J. Allen Hynek is the main researcher for this case. He interviewed the witness directly. He's anonymous. We'll call him John. He was an Army officer in Vietnam who worked as an aircraft observer. It was his duty to call in ground and airstrikes and identify aircraft, which he could do sometimes by sound alone. Now, at the time of his encounter, he was employed as a professional photographer working for a private company engaged in highly classified military projects. And in fact, John held a top secret clearance. As J. Allen Hynek says about this case rates as one of the most bizarre UFO cases I have ever come across. It fits no recognized pattern, yet was independently witnessed by two highly technical trained people separated by more than a mile. So John's encounter began when he was at home in his workshop repairing a camera. It was 8:15 p.m. again on March 8, 1982. And I'll just let John describe what happened. As he says, I was seated at my workbench repairing a camera when the tools in my hands started to shake and I became aware of a low rumbling sound which intensified in the space of approximately 10 seconds to the point where I could no longer hold the tools in my hands because of the vibration. At that point, the whole house was shaking, and my first thought was that we were having an earthquake. Later, we found that the vibration of the house had been so great that our washing machine and a floor cabinet had moved 2 to 3 inches from the wall, and the flooring had separated from the wall in the amount of a ½ inch at one place for a distance of 2 feet. At the point when the whole house was shaking, I went into the hallway and met my wife coming out of the bedroom. We both quickly went outside as the sound now seemed to be coming from a definite direction and seemed to be getting closer. And it was, because now on the porch, John, with a pair of binoculars in his hand, and his wife both saw this massive craft. He estimates it was about 75 feet high, only 100 feet away, moving at about 80 knots. He said the object itself was quite dark, just a black mass with about 40 to 50 small red lights on either side. He estimates it was about 100 feet long, 75 feet wide. Now they do have 2 dogs, and they do live right next to an airport. And when low-flying planes would come by, the dogs would often come out and bark at them. But when this object showed up, the dogs did something very unusual. As John says, they behaved as never before. They were extremely frightened and hid under the bed, something they never do. The dogs were petrified. So as they stared at this, neither John nor his wife could believe their eyes. They could not understand what they were looking at. As John says, what we saw doesn't fit into anything I've ever seen before in my whole life. I thought it might be an aircraft crashing, but dismissed this thought almost immediately as it remained at a constant high and was moving too slowly, well below the stall speed of any aircraft I know. And its lights looked like no aircraft configuration I had ever seen. So he was most impressed by its slow speed and the low but very loud rumbling sound. Also odd was that even though there was a near full moon, the structure between the lights was, quote, absolutely black. As he says, this thing was just completely black. In fact, it looked to him almost like it was absorbing the light around it, with almost no reflection on it whatsoever. Both he and his wife did have the impression of immense size, and the weird rumbling sound reminded them of the movie Close Encounters in the mother ship. As John says, it was nothing like anything I know about. It was very close. There was no exhaust or smell. It was like being in a rowboat out in the ocean and having a giant oil tanker come slowly by. You really get the feeling of immensity. So this object moved off, and following the sighting, as is understandable, John was deeply shaken up. As he says, I was trying hard to hold on to reality. So in a search for answers, he started making some phone calls. He called the local and state police, who told him that they were, quote, swamped with calls from all kinds of people reporting UFOs. Now, having technical knowledge of aircraft and knowing the lingo, he phoned the local airport and the local naval air station in Norfolk, Virginia, also the Sikorsky Air Service at Norfolk, and Westover Air Force Base. Now, the airports did say that they had also received calls, but the other agencies provided no useful information. The air traffic controller at Oxbury Airport said that they had actually seen it, and that the, quote, thing had come right over one of their own house. This is located about 2 miles from John's house. And this guy said that the vibration from this object had made a coffee cup literally walk across the table and fall to the floor. So the next day, John spoke with a fellow Air Force Reserve officer who was driving home in this area, and he also saw the same object. His friend is in fact a program manager who works on camera systems, electronic countermeasures, laser designators, and more. So a very intelligent guy. And he was driving along this country road when this object, he says, came about 500 feet over his car, causing a very heavy vibration. It was moving very slowly, he said, almost hovering. He briefly wondered if this could be a formation of helicopters, but when he saw this black mass and the red lights at the side, he described it exactly the same way. He realized it wasn't anything he knew about. It was something completely out of the realm of his experience. As he says, it bothered me that I couldn't identify them. No structure, no silhouette. So J. Allen Hynek was very impressed by this case, and as he says, the case is so bizarre that one can hope that some of our readers can suggest a logical explanation. The case is a complete maverick. Indeed, when Bob Gribble of the UFO Reporting Center in Seattle notified the center, QFOS, about it, I was on the verge of not following it up at all, but I finally decided to waste one phone call on it. An amazing encounter by any definition. J. Allen Hynek was absolutely persuaded it did take place. There apparently were quite a few witnesses. I suspect there's a lot more than the ones we know about, because again, people rarely report their encounter in any official capacity. And this guy did because he was educated with aircraft and he wanted to know what was going on. It wouldn't surprise me a bit if there's a whole line of people who saw this object but didn't tell anybody. Now let's move to another very strange case, which I call High Strangeness in Slocina. This occurred on December 27, 2013 in Slocina, Poland. And yeah, this is a very unusual case. Again, a simple sighting, but technically a close encounter of the second kind. The effects that the witnesses describe in this case are really quite unusual. It's why I wanted to include this case. It's really quite compelling, and I think you'll find it really fascinating. This final, very unusual close encounter of the second kind comes from researcher Arak Miazga. This one involves two witnesses, Anna, age 64, and her daughter Ewa, age 22. It was 10:42 p.m. on December 27, 2013, and Ewa was turning off the Christmas tree lights in their home, again located in Slocina, Poland. This is when a light outside the window caught her eye, and looking outside, she saw a dome-shaped craft covered with bright orange lights coming out from behind a nearby house. It was slightly larger than a full moon. She said it had short and long rays of light coming off the surface, weird rays of light. The object itself pulsated with light. It was pretty close, about 150 meters away, 400 to 500 feet, no higher than 10 meters above the ground, about 30 feet. So she called out for her mother. They both saw it. They estimated the size of this object was about 7 to 9 feet, no larger than a small passenger car. It made no sound that they could hear. So the mother, Anna, joined her daughter and actually used a pair of binoculars to look at this object. She could see a red light on the right side and a green light on the left. She said it was hovering right above the high voltage electric lines. But weirdly, the rays of light coming out of this object were not normal. Some were short, some were long, about 2 meters. But what was so weird is that they kind of cut off after reaching a length of about 2 meters. And while the object itself was quite bright, it was not blinding. In fact, they said it was rather, quote, pleasant to the eye. It did occasionally tilt, giving them a good view of the underside. This is not a normal plane or aircraft or helicopter, as you can see from their drawings. But there were some very high strangeness details. One was that the witnesses were listening to the radio at the time of the encounter. But the very moment this object came into view, the entire environment around them became enveloped in complete silence. The radio didn't fuzz up or malfunction or turn off. They could just no longer hear it. Also weird were these strange black spots that were swirling around the object. It looked almost, to them, like it was absorbing the light around it. And in fact, as it approached a street light, the beam from the street light seemed to get pulled away from the light itself. I mean, the light didn't go out, it stayed on, but the beam itself kind of disappeared or was somehow suppressed. In fact, even the outlines of the nearby houses next to this object became pulled into this weird darkness. It looked to the witnesses almost as if the object was exerting some sort of energy field around it that was pulling light towards it. And a third element of high strangeness was that both witnesses felt that time almost seemed to come to a stop. They watched this object, they thought, for about 10 to 15 minutes as it moved around. But when the object moved off, they were shocked to see that only 5 minutes had passed. So that was weird. And as soon as this object was out of view, the noise of the radio immediately filled the house. So they were really puzzled by that, and in fact, the daughter was so filled with fear that she was unable to get any sleep that night. She had previously had 2 encounters, and after the first one had been having regular dreams about UFOs. This one really scared them for some reason, and at this point, neither of them wanted to talk about UFOs anymore or have any other encounters. So there you go, another amazing high strangeness case. I like that one because it is a good example of the so-called Oz factor, with this unnatural silence that pervades the environment during an encounter. But it's also got incredibly strange effects involving light around this craft. And also, of course, the weird sense of timelessness that the witnesses report. This is something we do hear in a lot of cases. So yeah, it definitely is an important case, I think. So that's it for today. 8 cases from all over the world, which you would probably categorize as close encounters of the second kind because they do affect the environment in some way. Yeah, no humanoids, but I think you'll agree those cases were very interesting and certainly add to our knowledge of what's going on here. That's why I wanted to do this episode. think these cases show just how incredibly strange a UFO encounter can be. So that's it for today. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions because it's up to you to do it. Don't know if our governments are ever going to willingly disclose. It's up to all of us to make sure that we know all we can about this subject. So yeah, keep searching for the truth, and most important of all, keep having fun. I will see you next Friday. Stay safe. Bye for now.